Introduction to SAS Macro Language. Why use macros? Because macro code takes longer to write and debug than standard SAS code, you generally won't use macros in programs that will be run only a few times. But if you find yourself writing similar code over and over again, then macros may make your job easier. The topics that we are going to cover include macro concepts, macro variables, macros themselves, macro parameters, and the SAS utility called call simput, which will be covered in the next series of slides and demonstration. With macros, you can make one small change in your program and have SAS respond to that change throughout the program. Macros allow you to write a piece of code once and use it over and over in the same program or in different programs. And you can store macros in an auto-call library, and then they can be shared between programs and between programmers. Probably the simplest use of the SAS Macro Facility is the creation of a macro variable. Macro variables should be used if the same value needs to be changed in more than one location each time a program is submitted. Macro variable definitions should be located at the top of a program. There are several ways to create macro variables, the easiest of which is the use of the %let, and we will talk about that shortly. So a macro variable can be a variable name, a numeral, or any text that you want substituted in your program. And macro variables can be two kinds in scope. They can be either local or global. A local macro variable is defined and used inside a macro. A global macro variable can be used anywhere in your program. So here is the general syntax for defining a macro variable and how it is referenced. The keyword %let is followed by the name of the macro variable you are defining, an equal sign followed by the characters you are assigning the name. And the characters will often be a list of variables. And this defining of a macro variable is usually placed in open code. It's not inside a data or a proc step. To reference the macro variable in your program, place an ampersand followed immediately by the name of the macro variable. SAS will substitute the value of the macro variable every place it sees the ampersand reference. Macro variables are particularly helpful in making a program easier to modify, and we will see some examples of that in the demonstration. So here is an example of a macro variable. I've created a macro variable and it's called macText, and I've set it equal to a numeric variable called eyes. And this is a numeric variable on the data set called temp. That's why we're using this data set in this example. So eyes is a numeric variable that represents a measurement of vision. And we've created this macro variable called macText. And then we see here some code to do the procedure proc means. And we see here proc means data equals temp. And when SAS sees this ampersand and macText, it's automatically going to substitute in this variable eyes into the var statement. Similarly, when SAS sees the title statement with double quotes, means, hyphen, ampersand, macText, it's going to substitute in the variable eyes for the title. When you use macro variables in a title statement, you must put your title statement with double quotes. So normally we can do a title statement with single quotes or double quotes. When you're using a macro variable in a title statement, you need to put it in double quotes. Otherwise, when you see your output, it's just going to show this ampersand mac underscore text instead of the variable i's, which is what you want in your title statement. Now, macros are a larger piece of a program that may contain complex logic, including complete data and proc steps. And macros are very useful when similar code is used repeatedly. The general form of a macro, you start defining a macro with a % macro, and then you give the macro a name. And then you include some kind of text. It can be a procedure, it can be part of a data step. And then to end the macro, you have a %mend. So the macro text is a set of SAS statements. We are creating a macro called stats. And within that macro, we are saying proc means, var, height, weight, pulse. And then we end our macro with the %mend. And then notice here we are creating a temporary data set called work. And we're saying if sex equals F for female. And then we're invoking our macro. So we're saying %stats. When SAS sees that, it is automatically going to produce proc means of height, weight, and pulse for this data set that's now just females. Then let's say we create a different data set and we're just selecting males. If we invoke the macro again, it's now going to do a proc means using the variables height, weight, and pulse on males. So what if you wanted your macro stats to do proc means on other variables besides height, weight, and pulse? Parameters are macro variables whose values are set when you invoke the macro. So parameters can give your macros more flexibility. And you'll see that when we use macro parameters, they are listed between parentheses in the %macro statement. So here is an example of the same macro that we were doing before, but instead of having a proc means and a var of height, weight, and pulse, we're using positional macro parameters. So this gives us more flexibility when we invoke our macro. And to indicate that we're using macro parameters, notice that in our proc statement, we now have an ampersand proc, which matches the name of the positional parameter in the macro statement, and for var, ampersand vars, which matches the positional parameter vars in our macro statement. And so then when we invoke these macros, we list what we want to go into these positional parameters. So in this first example, when we do %stats, it's going to end up that we are going to do a proc means, and the variables that we are going to use in that proc means are height and weight. In the second example, we're doing a %stats. The procedure we're doing is going to be univariate, so we're doing a proc univariate, and the variables here are going to be systolic blood pressure and diastolic blood pressure. So now, with the use of these macro positional parameters, we've made these macros more flexible. Now view the SAS demonstration video, Macro Demo 1.